I have a newly seeded lawn area. How do I water to make sure it flourishes?
Okay, so you have a new area that's seeded, and of course the watering for establishing new seed is different than established turf. New seed takes about 3 to 4 weeks to come up and establish itself, but it really takes about 3 months and 3 to 5 cuts to really settle in. Like fresh produce outside of your refrigerator, seed going dry won't last more than about 24 hours. So it's important to keep it moist. Saturate it thoroughly the first 24 to 48 hours, really so wet that you can't hardly walk on it. This gets you over the hump, and it's easier to maintain moist conditions if you get it initially saturated. So again, on day 1 and 2, initially you're going to get it wet enough you can hardly walk on it. Most likely that means watering multiple times a day. Through week 1 and 2, with seed, the sun and the wind can dry it out fast, and deep waterings don't really help since it's just the surface that needs to be kept wet. You overcome this with more frequent waterings, but less volume sometimes is required. Watering every day, or better yet, shorter runs twice a day should do the job of keeping the surface moist. So by week 3, you should be able to scale back your watering a bit. You still need to be able to keep things moist, but you shouldn't have to keep it saturated wet all the time. Most likely this means watering every day still, but reducing your length of time of water. You may be able to cut back to every other day depending on the sun and the wind conditions. Sun and the wind conditions, when we're talking about keeping the surface wet, is really going to be critical, and it's going to have a lot to say about how much water you have to use. By week 4, you should see grass being up probably 3 or 4 inches tall. You're probably not quite ready to cut it yet, but you're getting close. Let it firm up enough that you can walk on it, and once your grass plants get about 5 inches tall, you can cut. Okay, so these grass plants are sort of in stage 1, where you're starting to see grass plants emerge. It looks a little patchy. That's pretty normal, particularly at this stage. But you can also see the ground is pretty dry here. So these plants are probably hanging in there, but if they went another couple of days without moisture, they're really going to start to suffer. If you move over into here, and you can see grass is in the same stage at stage 1, and you'll see the ground is darker here, and there's just a little bit more moisture there. You really don't want to let it get past about that. So it can go in these gaps of wet, dry, or wet, moist, wet, moist. Hello, kitty cat. She likes the new grass. It can go in these little gaps of wet, moist, wet, moist. It just can't last very long. So you can see the sunlight penetrates through these grass blades and gets all the way to the soil. Wind will do that too. So the surface here will dry out pretty quickly. But because the root system is only about this deep, they really don't have a lot of depth to grab moisture deeper in the soil. So although the soil may be moist 4 inches down, to this plant, since they can't reach that moisture, it's irrelevant to them. By week 5, maybe into 6, you should be able to go to some semblance of a normal watering schedule using our watering schedule by the holidays, particularly after it's been cut a couple of times. You might have to increase it a little bit from our normal watering schedule depending on how much sun or how hot it is. You can adjust these times frequency up or down a bit for extreme heat, wind, or mild and cloudy conditions. Newly seeded areas take about 18 months to go from bare ground to what you would expect if you sodded. Good watering, a lawn care program, overseeding in September are really required in this 18 months in order to get you to what you probably expect from a long-term standpoint with your turf. So with new seed, there's a lot of normal and sometimes heavy weed activity. The ground between the grass blades is wide, and therefore lots of room and opportunity for both grass blades and weeds or undesirable plants to populate. Little can be done about this in early stages of this process to prevent it. No weed control will work and not harm the new grass plants you're trying to develop. So try not to let the weeds bother you. You're really making the conditions good for everything to grow. Stage 4 is getting new plants established and cut 3 or 4 times. So this is probably likely going to be 60, 70 days after the initial seeding was done. Stage 5 is to fertilize, do some post-emergent weed control. Post-emergent weed control typically is something either your lawn care company is going to do, or if you're doing it yourself, you'll put down something that is fertilizer and have a broadleaf weed control in it. That's when you can start dealing with and attacking some of the weed population. The grass is now up, it's been cut several times, it's hardened off, it can handle the herbicides that you might put on it to kill the weeds. So stage 6 gets into September, where you can overseed. The reason that September ends up being good for doing lawn renovations, or if you had new seed to increase the seed population and grass population. So there's not a lot of weed activity going on at that period of time. So whether you're aerating or whether you're scratching up the surface or whether you're just broadcasting seed on top of the ground, September ends up being a good time. The weather conditions are relatively good for it. There's not a lot of weed activity, and it's a good time to use either a starter fertilizer or a winterizer fertilizer as well as seeding.